Lovely to see you all in the room. I see some future honors students and some advisors and maybe friends and family. Welcome. I'm thrilled to have you all here at the 2025 Watson Senior Thesis Honors Conference. My name is Nicole Pangborn. I am the director of the IAPA Honors Program, also a visiting lecturer here at the Watson Institute, and a sociologist by training. And I had the great honor of leading one of the two senior honors seminars this past fall, along with Professor Claudia Elliott here in the second row. So that means I got to witness about half of this year's cohort kind of up close, watching their work develop from an 8-page proposal all the way to the massive work of the thesis, which is, generally on the order of hundreds of pages. And these senior theses, which we're all excited to hear about today, are the product of over a year of sustained intellectual effort. Apologies for those who were here yesterday. I'm going to repeat some information because I see a lot of new faces. So I'd love to just make sure everyone in the room knows what this long sustained intellectual effort entailed for all of these students. So over a year ago, in their junior year, they began to kind of imagine the kinds of questions they were curious to explore, questions that reflected real, pressing social and political issues or dynamics in the world. They took the initiative to go out and find faculty advisors who had the substantive or methodological expertise to guide them in answering their questions. And they crafted formal research proposals to mark their commitment to seeing their projects through. The summer before their senior year, these students were already deep into their work, reading up on the scholarly literature, policy debates, and considering where their project fit into what we already know about the problems and issues they were interested in examining. In the fall, then, they enrolled in the International and Public Affairs Senior Honors Seminar. I led one section, as I mentioned, and Professor Elliott led the other. And in that seminar, students followed a really disciplined weekly writing schedule, producing analytical memos and staying on track to complete their first 2 chapters by December of this past year. And keep in mind that that is alongside all of their other commitments during senior year in the form of classes, extracurriculars, campus speakers, conferences, and travel. These are all ambitious young people. So you could just imagine how much they wanted to get everything they could out of their senior year while also making steady weekly progress on their thesis work. And what an accomplishment that is. And not only did they individually make progress during that fall senior honors seminar, but they helped each other make progress as well. These students all became thoughtful readers of their classmates' drafts, learning the generous act of providing constructive feedback and genuinely helping their peers improve. Throughout this time, they met regularly with their faculty advisors, many of whom are here today. These faculty members offered their expertise, mentorship, and steady guidance to these thesis students and were instrumental in helping them refine their research questions, plan their research design, and strategize about their data collection. I'd love to just briefly pause and acknowledge all of the time and effort and generosity these advisors have given our students. And brief round of applause, please. We're so grateful for your support. After the structure of the fall semester, all of these students were launched into the winter and spring with a bit more independence. They were faced with sometimes the sometimes daunting task of finishing their data collection, rounding up folks to interview, diving deep into the archives, reading old primary source data to inform their case studies, and in some cases processing and cleaning really messy quantitative data. And I think it's important to note that this kind of work, which is sustained, self-directed, and often solitary, requires an enormous amount of personal drive. These students were dedicated enough, got enough internal satisfaction from the process, that they kept at it, largely on their own. They lived and breathed their projects. They stayed committed to questions that didn't have easy answers, even when they had to adjust their approach on the fly. For example, to find an additional handful of interviews, folks who could provide a perspective that was emerging as important, or to dig deep into an extra historical case that turned out to be essential. They learned how to move swiftly back and forth between abstract academic theories and the real empirical data that was emerging from the world around them. And at some point on this journey, often quietly, and sometimes without really realizing it, these students crossed a threshold. They made the transition from consumers of knowledge to producers of knowledge. And I feel like that's really crossing a point of no return. These students are now experts in their thesis topics. They know these topics more deeply and intimately than anyone else here in this room. And they're the ones who are teaching us now. They're advisors, peers, friends, and family. And to our thesis students, now that you've made that leap, there's really no going back. You'll carry that authority with you wherever you go next. And I hope that the confidence from what you've achieved this year will always bring you strength. And so now, enough from me. Let's hear from these experts. Logistics quickly today. So what'll happen, and sorry, here are all of our experts for this year. Maybe a brief round of applause for them too. Sorry, I had to scour the web for like old pictures of many of you, so there might be some blast from the past. So what'll happen today is we're going to have 2 panels of 4 students each, maybe a brief stretch break in between them, and we'll have faculty advisors or faculty moderating the panels. And afterwards, we'll adjourn for a reception, a celebratory reception to mark the achievement of all these young scholars. And you'll see that each of you has an honors cord in front of you. That is for you to take home. You have all achieved honors in the IAPA degree concentration. So wear those proudly during graduation. All right, so now I'm delighted to call Professor Claudia Elliott up to the podium now to moderate our first panel, Political Protest, Political Stability, and State Capacity, Rethinking Causes and Effects.
Good morning, everyone. Honor students, again, advisors, family, friends, library specialists, all of those who have helped us get through the last year, if not year and a half. I can think of no better place to be on a potentially stormy, definitely gloomy day in Providence, spring day in Providence, than here in this very important room for IAPA students, the Joukowsky Forum at the Watson Institute, as we are about to be enlightened by the studies and the interesting ideas of the IAPA honors students. I say that sincerely, and I would have made that same comment if it were a bright, sunny, balmy beach day, because I think this really is the best place to be today. My name is Claudia Elliott. I'm a senior lecturer here at the Watson Institute. And as Professor Pangborn just mentioned, one of the 2 instructors for the mandatory thesis, research, and writing seminars that happen each fall. Indeed, all of the students on the panel today were in my fall class. So I'm quite versed, knowledgeable about their projects, and excited to hear from them. But I would like to take a moment at the podium to, again, congratulate all of the IAPA honors recipients. Again, I used to send emails saying, "Dear honors candidates," just to see what would happen. Not much did. But anyway, the fact is they are now recipients, and I would like, again, to acknowledge this outstanding academic achievement. It is my great pleasure to introduce the panel entitled Political Protest, Political Stability, State Capacity, Rethinking Causes and Effects. There's a lot going on in this title. So I'd like to say, I think there are kind of 2 very general overarching themes uniting these research projects. First, the concern with economic and socio-political dynamics of political change. And what do we mean by political change? We will have to wait to find out. But political change, and by extension, political non-change or continuity, and even the potential for either of those. Again, and kind of focusing on the arrows between causal factors and the consequences of political change, and for whom. There's also a second cross-cutting theme, more explicit in some of these projects than others, but definitely there. And that is the theme of democracy, democratization, and authoritarianism. So I will leave it at that and leave it up to each of these students to define those terms, explain those arrows, the processes underlying them, tell us what they've added to the scholarship on their topics, and why we should care, we in this room, what is important for us to know about these projects as thinkers and people who live in the world, big themes that are being present today in the news. So I'm going to begin this panel now by announcing the presenters in the order in which they will speak. And again, we'll hear from all of the presenters and have Q&A at the end for all. Our first presenter is Yelfaka Ayala Alamayo, The Effects of Monetary Unions on Political Stability, a comparative study of the West African Economic and Monetary Union and the EMU, or the European Economic and Monetary Union. Yab will be followed by Bianca Rosen, whose work is entitled Tribes and Tribulations, Morocco and the Arab Spring. Next is Giovanna, also known as Gigi to us, Alioto Pierre, Sacred Disruption, Protest Movements and Secularism under the Iranian Theocracy. And finally, certainly last but not least, Michelle Alas Molina, The Right to the City, the Politics of State Capacity for Participatory Budgeting, which is a study of Araraquara, Brazil. Yeah. Oops. That's okay.
Sounds good. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Yab Fikrayela Alamayo, or Yab, and today I'll be presenting my thesis on the effect of monetary unions on political stability. It is a comparative study of the West African Economic and Monetary Union, or WAMU, and the European Economic and Monetary Union, or the EMU. I'm from Ethiopia, so I am interested in all things of Saharan Africa. I want to contribute to more research, more data, and more interest in the academics on the region. And more than that, I was also a part of research that looked into the epidemic of coups across the Sahel, and also discovered that these unions exist in West and Central Africa specifically, and was interested if there was any correlation between the epidemic of coups and their existence. And furthermore, in terms of definitions, in the context of my study, political stability refers to the degree of mass political violence. This is protests, demonstrations, and riots. And this is drawing from the definition given by Zhongyi Pin, and also very similar in the literature on economic outcomes, studying the relationship between economic outcomes and political stability, usually known as social unrest. And in terms of the monetary unions, it draws directly from the definition given by the International Monetary Fund, that essentially defines it as a region or a zone that A, shares the same currency, and B, shares the same monetary policy. This affects things like inflation rates and employment. Yeah, so that's a definition. In terms of my research question, generally I'm asking to what extent and under what conditions do economic integrations and partnerships affect political stability? And I'm looking at a specific type of economic integration, and that is monetary unions. So to what extent do monetary unions affect political stability? And this is really significant because of the sheer size of monetary unions. Close to 1 billion people are under the authority of such monetary unions, or at least economic authority most directly. And given globalization, all of this, that means that it likely affects even more people. And so And secondly, I'm essentially in the literature connecting two bodies of literature. One, there's rich literature on the connection between monetary unions and economic outcomes, and on the other hand, the relationship between economic outcomes and political stability. So I'm really gapping this, or bridging this gap, not gapping it, bridging this gap between these bodies of literature, specifically under a comparative lens, which is something new in the literature. And finally, given the general rise in instability across the world, and specifically in the regions that I'm studying, it is important to study political stability, causes, consequences, and more importantly, also the rise in entry into or exit from types of unions, looking at ECOWAS, BRICS, NATO, the EMU, and so on. So it's significant in these ways. In terms of my argument, let me first define some things because there's a lot of boxes. So austerity measures, it's referring to measures that are taken by the government to decrease budget deficits. This would be things such as decreasing public spending or increasing taxes. Not fun, but usually that happens. And in terms of structural adjustment programs and conditional loans, these are essentially loans that are tied to conditions, often provided by the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the World Bank. And so essentially, it's saying, I'll give you $10 million if you depreciate your currency. I can't do that. But usually that is sort of the extent of the programs. And so my argument really relies on the conditional effect of monetary unions. That is, monetary unions are associated with political stability, given that the unions are capable of lending to member states within that union. And that capacity is then also associated with their control over austerity measures and economic reforms that are then associated with shifts in political stability. But if they do not have that capacity, this is often correlated, of course, with GDP and their income. If they do not have that capacity, that authority or control is then outsourced essentially to external lending institutions such as the IMF, such as the World Bank, and this includes external conditional loans. In terms of my research design, I primarily use process tracing. It is a method that traces causal mechanisms. It starts from expected outcomes and goes back to whatever variables it might be associated with. And so in terms of the WAMU, I look at Mali. It is a WAMU member, and specifically it has a diachronic value in its independent variable. This means that it was once not in a monetary union and is now in the union. And so that gives me sort of a pre-post analysis, which is really important here. And it also is data rich. In terms of Mauritania, I sort of consider it as my control state. It was never in a union and also is data rich, among other things. And so I essentially trace shifts in political stability, as I've defined it initially, across these three events. When Mali first joins the union in 1984, and the currency devaluation of 1994, a significant economic event in the union's history. And finally, in the Euro crisis, this is important because essentially, many of the states in the Union were once French colonies. The Union itself was established by France. And more importantly, it's not a past, it's not a historical relationship. It exists today because the currency itself is fixed to the euro, all right? And so the euro crisis is also very important to understand this relationship. And that being said, in terms of the EMU, I'm looking at France, given the historical ties, and also looking at the euro area crisis for similar reasons that I mentioned, one of the most significant economic and political events in the history of the Union. And in terms of sources, I'm using primarily protest databases. We're looking at SCAD, SPEED, the Mass Mobilization Project, and I'm also looking at public survey data and using events such as the Afrobarometer. And this gives us also an understanding of the perceptions of political stability and perceptions of economic outcomes that I also study. So I'm essentially looking at shifts across these events in political stability and tracing their causal mechanisms. In terms of the key findings, these are some of my key findings. First off, I find that the association of monetary unions with political stability is conditional on internal lending capacity or capabilities. And this essentially means that if they are able to lend to countries within the monetary union, then they also have that control over austerity and economic reforms, which are then associated with political stability. So in the case of the EMU, I find that it is negatively associated with stability. That means it causes or is associated with increases in instability through its control over austerity. And in terms of the WAMU, I find no significant association. That is, it does not necessarily have control over austerity and economic reforms, and rather outsources that to external institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank. And finally, in terms of implications, in terms of implications specifically for the WAMU and Sub-Saharan Africa region in general, we're looking at the fact that being in a union or not isn't the most significant thing that is going to mitigate instability. It is rather financial independence. And this means internal economic growth and economic development for the states rather than unionizing or not. And this does not really, in terms of the EMU, we're looking at contextually reassessing the impact of austerity. This means looking at the long-term, medium-term, and also short-term impacts of austerity measures and economic reforms that will vary by country. And finally, in terms of also theory, there's a need for within and across comparative methods or comparative approaches. And yes, this means that looking at the theories on optimum currency areas and also like even theories on conditional loans, there needs to be an understanding of what happens within the union and across unions. And finally, in policy, my study supports the discretionary approaches to monetary policy. And that means that giving policymakers more discretion to adjust monetary policies rather than saying policy that works in one region will also work in another region. And finally, in terms of future research, I'm suggesting or I'm recommending more comparative research across monetary unions or even within monetary unions and looking at other forms of economic integrations and of course, looking at other forms of research methods as well, including econometric research. So yes, that is my thesis. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming.
Okay. Oh, no, thank you. Okay, cool. Hi, thank you all so much for being here and good morning. My name is Bianca. I'm excited to present to you guys today my thesis, Tribes and Tribulations, Morocco and the Arab Spring, which tries to figure out why Morocco experienced political stability during a period of protracted political instability, and I'll go into that throughout the course of this presentation. My interest in this topic started after I took my thesis advisor, Professor Jennifer Johnson's course on North African history, which was my first exposure to Moroccan history and politics, and then was something that I got to continue to explore this past summer while I was in Morocco on a critical language scholarship. And it feels very full circle to be standing in front of you today chatting about all of this. So what was the Arab Spring? Some of you might have heard about the Arab Spring, maybe remember it happening. In short, the Arab Spring was a protest wave that engulfed the Middle East and North Africa region, or MENA region, roughly between 2010 and 2013. It resulted in governments toppling all across the region, with dictators that had been in power for decades upon decades being ousted in countries such as Egypt and Tunisia, and countries such as Yemen and Syria being mired by civil war, the consequences of which they are still dealing with today. Yet while demonstrators in countries such as Cairo, as you can see in this image in the bottom left, were chanting for Isqat al-Nizam, or regime change, protesters in Morocco were chanting for Islah al-Nizam, or reforming the regime. That reform-based approach to protest was coupled by a monarchy that was at its fundamental level conciliatory, that within 2 weeks of the first protest starting in Morocco, the king, Mohammed VI, gave a speech which announced the creation of a new constitution that would institutionalize a lot of the reforms that were being touted on the streets. And so within 2 weeks of the first major protests, Morocco managed to make it through spring largely unscathed. Why? In essence, is my question. What explains what scholars have dubbed the Moroccan exception, or the phenomenon that explains Morocco's political stability during this time period? And on a more broader level, why are countries politically stable? What explains political stability? And that is what I'm trying to answer. I'm not asking questions that haven't been asked before. And in fact, the literature is saturated with a number of different hypotheses that are trying to figure out why Morocco was politically stable during this time period. I think the two most interesting of them for the purposes of my thesis are the fact that Morocco is a hybrid regime, which means it's sort of somewhere between a democracy and an autocracy, and that it's a monarchy. And people attribute that political system to Morocco's stability during this time period. What was notable to me, though, was the complete absence in the literature of any discussion of what I deem one of the most important features of Morocco's society, and that is the role of tribes or tribalism. One thing that struck me in my time in Morocco was that one of the first things that I would learn about someone is the name of their tribe. That was within 30 seconds of meeting somebody that was a stranger to me 30 seconds before that. So then why is the literature deeming tribe to be an anachronism or something of the past, a primitive form of social organization? I decided to look into that by focusing on Morocco's Amazigh population. You may have heard of them as Berbers. I use the term Amazigh in my thesis, which I'm happy to go into more in the Q&A. The Amazigh people are Morocco's largest ethnic group, an indigenous group composing roughly 40% of Morocco's population. The reason that I chose to study them, though, was because of their incredibly rich history of negotiating with the Moroccan monarchy from time immemorial up until the present day, with particular emphasis on the Arab Spring, which saw the realization of one of the activist movement's core demands, which was the institutionalization of their language in the Moroccan constitution. So how did I do this? I first used process tracing. I tracked causal chains in Morocco's history to try and explain why the Arab Spring unfolded the way that it did. And two, I conducted discourse analysis, or in other words, I looked at blog posts, news articles, I talked to people, and I tried to figure out why they thought the way that they thought and what role tribalism played in this incredibly chaotic time. What were my findings? So in theoretical terms, I'm basically arguing that tribalism, when combined with a monarchy and hybrid regime like Morocco's, contributes to social cohesion and with it to political stability. And I want to emphasize two things here. Tribes had two main effects, which I talk about in my thesis. One is they create what I term as negotiation zones. Negotiation zones instill people a sense of belonging, and when people feel like they belong, they're less likely to demand regime change. What are negotiation zones? They're spaces, both tangible and intangible, that diffuse tension, that essentially get people in a room and force them to talk about issues that might be bothering them so that they don't rebel. The second thing that tribes do is they provide people with a way of thinking about the world, with a set of cultural values and political views that ultimately shape their demands during the Arab Spring. And that is what my research found, that the fact that that Moroccans were advocating for regime change was a result of these values instilled in them within their tribes. And I think that this has really two major implications, which I'll come back to at the end, hoping I have time to do that, which one is the fact that tribalism is not a harbinger of political instability. Literally everyone in the literature says that tribalism would contribute to political instability. And by definition, that kind of makes sense. The notion that you would be more loyal to a group more than to your state. But in Morocco, people's loyalty towards a group strengthened their loyalty towards their state. And that's what my research revealed. And what that means is that we're also contesting this notion that it's all about monarchies, that monarchies are the reason that countries are politically stable in the Middle East, in countries such as the Gulf and Morocco and Jordan, and the list goes on. But in reality, it is tribes and how they fundamentally shifted Moroccan political culture that compelled the monarchy to offer concessions during this time period. And that is a self-reinforcing perpetual cycle that can be traced from Morocco's pre-protectorate period up until the present day, which is what my thesis does. So what do I mean by tribal negotiation zones? I wish I had more time to go into this in depth. I talk about a bunch of different examples of negotiation zones, WhatsApp group chats, tribal meetings, and also just by definition, the fact that someone's last name alludes to what tribe that they're part of is an elucidation of this idea of tribes as a familial network that is both real and imagined. One interview that really stood out to me was of this one guy that once a year goes back to his tribe and gathers to talk about every single local issue that's facing that local community. So tribes, by just their structure, provide a forum through which to discuss issues plaguing local communities, and that also translates on the national level. And two, tribes provide cultural and political blueprints. And I think one of the most exciting parts of this research process was when I found this one blog post, which you'll all enjoy. It's called The Moorish Wanderer, Diary of a Confused Moroccan Left-Wing Radical, which basically showed that in tribal areas, people were more likely to support the king. People were more likely to go to the polls and to vote in favor of the constitutional referendum. What does that mean? That means that tribes played an instrumental role in driving the political process. They were political catalysts. So what are the key takeaways of everything that I just said? I think if you can remember one thing from this presentation, it's that tribes shape experiences. They shape the way Moroccans experience the Arab Spring, the way that they saw it, the way that they lived through it, and that they produce content. They literally instill in people a way of thinking about Moroccan politics. The second thing is that tribe is not an anachronism, but it is woven in the entire fabric of Moroccans' political behavior, which is contrary to a lot of what the literature would have us believe about the relationship between tribalism and political stability. Three, theories of monarchical resilience or hybrid regime stability alone do not explain the Moroccan exception. It is their interplay with tribes that produces political stability. And what I mean here is that when we're just attributing something to a political system by its definition being more stable, we're ignoring the human aspect to all of this, that people are mobilizing on the ground and thinking a certain way. And I think tribes gets at sort of the fundamental layers of Moroccan culture that is driving people to not call for regime change during this period of chaos and instability. And more broadly, if we really, really zoom out, my thesis is not just about how belonging to a tribe affects political stability, but how just in general, belonging to a group is going to change the way that people experience the world. And I think that the Moroccan case has analogies and applications to many, many parts of the world. And also, I think that the future of political stability at large is in question when you start to think about the withering away of group belonging and senses of individuality, which continue to supersede people's loyalty towards a specific group. And am I out of time? Okay, well, thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. Okay. So for centuries, sociologists have predicted a decline in religion in tandem with what we call modernity and rationalization, whatever that means. And while this was true for a while, the 21st century has been dubbed the global return of religion from exile. So what this means is that both in our personal affiliations and in the institutions that we choose to elect, religion is growing in prominence. There we go. So my central puzzle of this thesis is that given this nonlinear rise and fall of religion globally, what role do social movements play in the broader process of secularization? And how do protest movements interact with secularism in theocratic countries in particular? Now, this has both theoretical and practical significance. Theoretically, there are three main kind of schools of thought that help us understand why religion might decline. And the first one, secularization theory, argues that this is a byproduct of rationality. So as societies or states become more rational, they inherently lose their religious appeal. Second is religious politics, which argues that as religion enters politics, it kind of leads to this gradual disenchantment because it appears so human. And then religious markets model argues that when the supply of religion is proliferating, people will want to be religious. And when it's declining or when the religious market is regulated, religion will also decline. And the issue with these theories is that they imply a very pervasive passivity to secularism. What I mean by that is that it neglects the idea that religion is something that is often rooted in really complex cultural, social, historical facets of people's identities. It's not so easy to be moved as, a gradual process acting on a population. So what my research does to that extent is it studies protest movements specifically to look at how people, think about, negotiate, understand secularism as part of what they want and what they want in their lives. The other theory this is significant for is identity theory, which is the idea that your identity gets emboldened when you protest something as part of a group. So if you're a woman, you might feel more emboldened in your womanhood if you're protesting with a bunch of other women. The issue with this theory is that it completely neglects secularism whatsoever as an identity group, instead arguing that it is the lack of an identity or the lack of religion. But the issue with this is that secularism right now has become very politically charged, especially with the rise of religious governments, and it needs to be understood as an identity group that can help form cohesive protest. Practical significance. So first, this research can help us understand what resistance looks like, covertly and overtly. It can also help us understand state stability. In theocracies and religiously governed states, secularism targets the roots of legitimacy as opposed to just targeting, dissatisfaction with an individual or an individual policy. And then most importantly, it can help us understand shifts and upheavals in countries that aren't just theocracies, but are religiously governed in general. Religion and politics are very deeply intertwined across a spectrum of states, including full-blown theocracies to the rise of religious nationalist parties, to just, a subliminal association between religion and politics. So what I mean by this is, for example, if you're an American and you're a conservative, you're more likely to be emboldened in your Protestantism or Christianity or evangelicalism, or you're more likely to convert to those religions than if you're a liberal, in which case you're more likely to lose your religion. And that has something to do with our, predominant social assumptions among political groups. So I decided to undertake this research within the context of the Islamic Republic of Iran and the 2022 Women Life Freedom Movement. So in Iran, we're witnessing a notable decline of religion in the 21st century. In 1979, at the turn of the Islamic Revolution, 97% of Iran voted in favor of the Islamic Revolution. But in 2020, 50% of Iranians say that they have lost their religion completely. And as of today, 50,000 of the 75,000 mosques built at the time of the revolution have closed due to a lack of attendance. So today, Iran is one of the most secular countries in the Middle East, if not the entire world. And I chose it because it very blatantly goes against the three main theories of secularism. That is, you cannot explain the rise of secularism in Iran as a passive process. It just doesn't make sense. Within Iran, I look at the 2022 protest movement, Women Life Freedom, which was a movement that began after a young Kurdish woman, Mahsa Amini, died in the custody of the morality police for incorrectly wearing her hijab. And this protest included hundreds of thousands of people, men and women, across age ranges, socioeconomic statuses, etc. And while protest itself is not new by any standard in Iran, Women Life Freedom specifically targeted the religious and ideological orthodoxy of the Islamic regime, which in many ways was a divergence from the political and economic protests of the past. So for my research, I conducted key informant interviews with scholars, diplomats who have engaged with or lived in and studied Iranian politics. I read over 400 archival data sources on the Women Life Freedom movement, and I studied a month of coverage of the protests from the leading newspapers on either the opposition and on the Islamic regime side. And across these three sources, three themes came out so prevalently. It was so obvious what the literature was trying to tell me, or what my evidence was trying to tell me. The first was that Women Life Freedom represented the manifestation of secular trends in Iran. So secularism is by no means new. It's been growing for years, and we can see that obviously in the statistics I mentioned earlier, but also in the idea that there's been a decline in the use of names like Muhammad and Fatima. There's been a rise in young people getting married at later ages, or young people living together without being married, etc. So there's a subtle consensus, but Women Life Freedom grabbed onto those latent trends and kind of brought it forward as something to show. So I spoke to the head of political affairs at a prominent embassy in Tehran, and he explained to me that secularism within the context of the Women Life Freedom movement can be described as the cat's finally out of the bag. Second is the idea that religion kind of starts to become viewed as a form of oppression or as a tool of oppression. So Women Life Freedom was incredibly violent. Estimates hold that over 550 people died, of which roughly 68 were children, and around 60,000 people were imprisoned. So there became this sentiment that violence made people confront their religion's interaction with the mortal world. This idea that when God becomes the justification for pain, you no longer want to believe in that God. Like, if this is what Islam is, then I'm not a Muslim, was the association that was made. I read a testimony by a photographer who engaged in the protest that I found really potent and that I wanted to share. He wrote, "If seeing a 12-year-old shot in the head with a military weapon doesn't awaken your religious consciousness, then nothing will." I don't think anything can put it better than that. And then finally, Women Life Freedom created this, or emboldened this bifurcation of society into different identity groups, religious and secular. It emboldened the idea that there was an immediate association between someone in a chador, a hijab, a religious symbol, and then being a regime supporter, even if that wasn't necessarily true. And then on the secular side, a new identity emerged that was rooted in this pre-Islamic revolution, Qajar dynasty era Persian, greatness. But there was an imposition to choose between being part of the colonizing force, that was a term I heard a lot in testimony, or being Iranian. So you had to choose between being a Muslim or an Iranian because being a Muslim was fundamentally socially tied to being a supporter of the Islamic Republic. So here I have an example. On the left is a photograph of the Iranian flag as we know it today. Above and below the symbol, it reads Allah Akbar, which means God is great. And then on the right is a flag that's been seen in protest movements today. And as you can see, it still has the same colors as the current Iranian flag, but in the middle is a symbol of Persian greatness, and religious imagery has been completely stripped of it. So there's this idea of taking back Iran from the Islamic Republic, and the idea that you can't do that while still being Muslim. Okay. So overarchingly from these, I can kind of argue that protests against theocracy embolden secularism because they create a binary choice between the religious and secular ways of life. And there are three really big implications for this. The first is it can give us insight into domestic politics. I mentioned earlier that religion and politics empirically run along similar lines in countries like the United States and Turkey. And my findings stress that understanding this dynamic as something that can give us a lot of political insight is really important. And that we've kind of been throwing away that by assuming that it's a product of a gradual, passive shift towards, modernity or whatever. So it can be a really important data point. The other thing is informed policy. My research gives us a lot of insight into how political protests form and kind of what it means. And that can help both the states engaging with protests and international governments forming foreign policy. And then finally, and what I think is most important, is it can teach us a lot about what resistance looks like. It can look like this woman here in the middle who's risking her life, taking off her veil in the streets in Iran, but it can also look like an older woman who's been an Orthodox Shia Muslim her entire life who no longer wants to go to mosque because she doesn't agree with the current religious establishment. So on that note, I wanted to read a final quote that I found during my research from a farmer living in rural Iran in 2003. He writes, "We replaced one corrupt monarch with thousands of corrupt clergy. We were already Muslims and we did not have a revolution to become Muslims. Our dreams were of equality, independence, and justice. But I hope that when they leave, we will still be Muslims, and my God can be great again."
Good morning, everyone. It is an honor to be here with you all today to present the product of years of primary field research, data collection, and analysis in this thesis, "The Right to the City, the Politics of State Capacity for Participatory Budgeting in Araraquara, Brazil." Before we begin, I would like to extend my sincerest thanks to the faculty, mentors that have guided this endeavor. To my thesis readers, Professor Patrick Heller and Pierre de Galbert, thank you for your extraordinary mentorship and dedication to this project. To Professor Claudia Elliott, thank you for leading our thesis seminar. To Dr. Collins and Pam Jennings, who are not here today, but thank you for introducing me to participatory budgeting. And to Professor Anya Bassett, who so loved nurturing the whole student and who I know is very proud of us all. Participatory budgeting, or PB, is a democratic process where a city creates open, accessible forums allowing residents of that city to be involved in municipal budgetary decisions. Residents describe their needs as a city, create projects to meet those needs, then vote on those projects to be funded by a city budget. PB is an example of participatory democracy, and its origins are inherently political. Participatory budgeting began in Porto Alegre, Brazil in 1989 after a brutal 21-year military dictatorship that severely repressed civil rights. The Brazilian Citizens Constitution of 1988, 2 years after the end of the dictatorship, propelled new ways of engaging the Brazilian citizenry, such as PB, which is now practiced in more than 11,000 municipalities around the world. However, PB in Brazil has had a tumultuous history, rising and falling alongside political icons. Most of the studies on PB explore the role of civil society organizations in the process while downplaying the role of the state. As a result, I ask these two questions. How do governments build and maintain democratic institutions at the local level? What conditions influence the emergence, continuity, and discontinuity of participatory democracy? And more specifically, what conditions influence the development and trajectory of participatory budgeting in Araraquara, Brazil? Brazil, as my case, has intrinsic value in being the birthplace of participatory budgeting. It is also one of the predominant cases of democratic consolidation in the global south. However, most of the literature on PB in Brazil is based on findings from Porto Alegre or Belo Horizonte, focusing on successful iterations of PB. Araraquara stands out due to its significant within-case variance. It is one of the longest-lasting cases of PB in Brazil in the last 30 years, as well as one of the most consistently volatile cases. In Araraquara, PB has risen and fallen. Politically, Araraquara reflects broader trends across Brazil, particularly in light of the municipal election results from October 6th of 2024, where the mayoral candidate from the Workers' Party, the Partido dos Trabalhadores, the largest party in all of Latin America, recently lost the race to the candidate from Jair Bolsonaro's Partido Liberal. This was a common shift to the right in cities across Brazil. Through this thesis, I'm presenting a theoretical framework to understand participatory budgeting as a democratic institution reliant on political negotiation to advance the right to the city, positioning its continuity and conversely its discontinuity in relation to state capacity and political party embeddedness. While Habermas's normative theory centers on the public sphere and radical democratic theorists like Freire and Lefebvre, along with liberal theorists, have extensively examined the interaction between civil society and the state, these approaches often overemphasize the role of civil society while underestimating the significance of the state and political parties in structuring participatory processes. I argue that PB is contingent on a state's capacity to structure and sustain mainly financially participatory mechanisms, reinforced by political party embeddedness. Embeddedness has two prongs: bureaucratic in terms of political alignment and power consolidation, and societal through strong voter bases and community coalition building. I'm employing embeddedness as conceptualized by sociologist Peter Evans, who coined the term embedded autonomy, establishing that the level of embedded autonomy is the basis for the industrial transformation of the state. I'm extending much of core welfare state theory, such as that established by Esping Anderson, saying power depends on electoral strength and labor mobilization, to argue that power and ability for the purpose of this thesis can be encompassed within state capacity. Speaking specifically on fiscal state capacity, that is the ability to raise revenue, Latin America has been economically stunted as a result of the concentration of economic and political power, as well as the incidence of internal conflict. Economists Darren Acemoglu, Simon Johnson, and James Robinson found that long-lasting, inclusive institutions, such as secure systems of wealth distribution and property rights, which means a greater investment in human capital and greater labor efficiency, in turn produce more wealth. They argue that much of what explains Latin America's historic economic underdevelopment is the lack of strong, inclusive institutions. These institutions remain today, meaning Latin America has been and will perennially be, quote unquote, behind. Despite this, Latin America has been a cradle of popular participation, and according to Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson, institutions matter. As part of my research, I conducted extensive interviews with functionaries, community leaders, and politicians who had direct involvement with the PB process in Araraquara, conducted ethnographic participant observation, and gathered data from the Office of Popular Participation in Araraquara, spending over a month in the field. I interviewed people from across the political spectrum. I talked to members of the far-right Republicanos Party, members from the Partido dos Trabalhadores. I even talked to the mayor. Mayor Edinho first created Araraquara's process in 2001 and has been developing it through 4 non-consecutive mayoral terms. I attended the campaign launch events and was able to experience the political fervor of an election. In my research, I found that Mayor Jinger's ability to implement his PB project was reinforced by his positive relationships with state and federal governments as a member of the Workers' Party, a mesa diretora or steering committee on the city council led by members of the party coalition nucleus, and codified rules that granted the executive branch significant power to initiate city projects. These are all factors that strengthen the bureaucratic embeddedness of his political party. His ability to implement participatory budgeting and other participatory democracy initiatives rely not just on formal institutional arrangements, but also on his ability to navigate shifting political alliances within the legislature and in the electoral arena. Changing coalitions and the presence of legislators aligned with the programmatic agenda of the PT, Partido dos Trabalhadores, strengthen the executive's capacity to execute projects. In this way, political party embeddedness, both in terms of ideological coherence within governing coalitions and the mayor's ability to consolidate legislative support, plays a crucial role in sustaining participatory institutions. This is demonstrative when we see Mayor Jingo's election loss in 2007, when a member of an opposition party won the mayorship. And he effectively dismantled PB, not intentionally, but through the design. He fragmented the regions that residents voted in, and he wasn't able to execute projects because it takes a dedicated amount of political will and fiscal accountability in order to execute these projects. In many cases, the mayor must seek alternative funding, including additional emendas parlamentares. The structure of PB funding is deeply intertwined with Brazil's uniquely political process of parliamentary amendment requests, where senators can choose to allocate federal budgetary amendments. The execution of participatory democracy in Araraquara has required significant political maneuvering, coalition building, and adaptation to shifting legislative and executive dynamics. However, the design of Araraquara's participatory budgeting process is intentionally inclusive, offering multiple localized opportunities for residents to attend PB plenaries and incorporating an online component to expand access. Throughout Mayor Jingo's 4 terms, he has appointed teams consistently reform the process to address identified shortcomings and better respond to community needs. Studying participatory budgeting is relevant not just for the study of Latin American politics, but for the study of democratic processes in general. Participatory budgeting is a transferable model by which to democratize public budgets, and its genesis in the aftermath of authoritarianism and conflict poses unique insights on how states and civil society adapt and grow in spite of or because of political instability. Brazil's emenda distribution system is a unique institutional pathway that is critical to the financing of PB projects. However, the hyper-fragmentation of political parties in a time of severe two-party divisions essentially forces the creation of coalition and political alliances and also affects the embeddedness of a political party across levels of government and within civil society. Araraquara's experience with PB offers broader insights into the relationship between state capacity, political embeddedness, and participatory democracy. As a relatively young democracy, Brazil continues to grapple with the legacies of its military dictatorship and the promise of deepening democratic engagement. The rise of the extreme right around the world has presented new challenges for participatory institutions, but it has also affirmed the importance of studying the conditions that enable their survival. The rise of the far right has coincided with a decline in pluralism, presenting challenges for participatory democracy. At the national level, Brazil's democratic institutions have been tested in recent years, particularly in relation to Jair Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro's federal police indictment for attempting to incite a coup and allegedly plotting assassinations of government officials highlights both the threats to democratic stability and the resilience of Brazil's institutions. That a former head of state can go through a formal judicial trial, facing real consequences for electoral eligibility. Simultaneously, the judicial systems of historically advanced democracies such as France are undergoing a similar review process. The far-right candidate Marine Le Pen was deemed ineligible in April of 2025 to run for public office for crimes of embezzlement. While this undoubtedly poses the question for many of their ability to feel represented by political candidates when their integrity is under scrutiny, it also upholds the core tenet of the rule of law. No one is above the law. In this sense, the capacity of a country's enumerated powers to execute their constitutional responsibility becomes a marker of the strength of a country's institutions and their state capacity to uphold democracy. Thank you very much.
Wow. These were some powerful presentations. Like, I'm totally moved by them right now. I think I would like to say, hats off to the students yesterday, those presenting today, not only for their authority in substance, right? The thesis itself, but also these authoritative presentations, their ability to communicate very complex ideas in such dynamic ways and interesting ways. These were fascinating projects. And I'm imagining you all have questions. There are some spaces to sit up front for those in the passageways out there. But yes, I'm just going to open the floor, and we'll take questions for all of the panelists.
Professor Elliott is right. There were 4 very impressive presentations. I would like to direct a question to Bianca. I was interested in your comments regarding the unique nature of the Moroccan culture and the negotiation zones of the tribes, and how valuable that was, and even unique in the country. And yet, at the end, you indicated that you felt applications in other situations and maybe in other cultures in other countries. So could you go a little more in depth into those 2 points you made?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for your question. I think the negotiation zones are an illustration of sort of broader debates, social cohesion and group belonging. And I think those theories have a certain universality to them that cuts across, not only the Middle East, but also, bleeds into the way we understand culture and group belonging in our own country as well. And I think negotiation zones are a unique way of describing how tribalism cultivated social cohesion and political stability in the Moroccan context. But I think more broadly, the notion of belonging to a group, whether that's your neighborhood community, a club at school, a family, instills in people a broader sense of belonging that can also strengthen their relationship to whatever state or broader community that they're a part of. And also has a really symbiotic and often challenged relationship with nationalism as well. To digress briefly, my initial interest in tribalism actually stemmed from studying abroad in Jordan this past spring, and I was having a conversation with my host family, who's part of it, and my host mother, who's part of a tribe, and I remember her distinctly saying that the reason that Jordan is not like Syria is because of the relationship between the king and the tribe, such that when there is political instability, such as what is currently going on in neighboring Israel and Palestine, the king travels to all of the tribes and makes sure that they're on board with him and that they're going to support him. And so I think, there's a lot more research that needs to be done in this topic, and I think a future thesis or a future study would do some sort of comparative analysis for sure. Thank you for your question.
Professor Levitas.
Yeah, listen, let me just reiterate what's already been said. All really great and compelling theses and performances today. You were all really wonderful. I guess I have questions to everybody, but I'll start, I guess, with Michelle. I think this is really interesting to focus on the relationship of the state to participatory budgeting. And I think you located one mechanism, which is, if I understood the argument correctly, in the parliamentary amendments and the ability of the national government to provide mayors of their own parties, in some sense, with additional funds to grease the wheels of participatory budgeting. Brazil is unique among federal states in as much as the national legislature has some regulatory control over municipalities. In most other federal states, municipalities are creatures of their state government. And I'm wondering whether the constitutional ability of the federal government to regulate municipalities plays a part in this story at all, or whether it is the more kind of pork barrel politics of the amendus process that's doing the work here?
Thank you so much, Professor Levitas, for that question. So you're absolutely right. So previously, there was a scandal in Brazil known as the secret budget, which was a series of amendments that did not seem to follow the rule of law as outlined as laid out in the Constitution, where diputados were exercising too much autonomy in the allocation of parliamentary amendments. And this was deemed unconstitutional by the Supreme Court of Brazil during Bolsonaro's administration. However, the amendments that exist, and there's different types of parliamentary amendments, the amendments that exist have varying levels of oversight. And some of the arguments that I heard from speaking with politicians across the political spectrum was critiquing exactly what they saw a lack of control in the allocation that senators decided to give to certain municipalities. So, for example, Mayor Reginho, who's from the Workers' Party and is set to potentially become the president of the Partido dos Trabalhadores, is very close to Lula. And right now, when Lula is in power, he receives more budgetary amendments. And when Bolsonaro was in power, he received less budgetary amendments. So this is a continuing struggle in Brazil where there is, at the same time, a level of oversight that has been laid out by the Constitution and by the Supreme Court of Brazil, and politicians who claim that there isn't enough control there.
Yeah, question for Giovanna, which is you began your presentation with the trope that the 21st century has become the century of religion, and then the story you tell is really about secularism in the face of theocracy, right? And I'm wondering what the other side of it is. If you went back to the beginning of the presentation, why do we see the rise of religion elsewhere if we see, the decline of religion in the face of a theocracy?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really interesting question. And thank you so much for asking it, because it actually gives me the opportunity to touch on some stuff I couldn't get to in the presentation. But part of the reason why we have this, resurgence of religion in the 21st century and this global rise of religion, the global return of religion from exile, is in part because of the growing appeal of conservative political parties across the world. And so we're seeing rises of religion in countries like India, where Hindu nationalism is becoming more prominent, for example, or for a while, no longer anymore, but we saw a resurgence in Islam in Turkey, where the ATP was gaining power. And so a lot of the correlation between religion and politics is rooted in people's preferences outside of their religious affiliation. And so the reason I looked at Iran was because it showed a shift from religion to secularism, but the same story is very prominent in terms of from secular to religious. When people, kind of similar to the example I talked about with the conservatives in the United States, when people associate or relate to a political party that's inherently tied to religion, they find the tenets of that religion more appealing and are kind of driven towards a stronger political affiliation with those parties. And so I think that, to your question about why do we see religion rising, I think it has a lot to do with the rise of, political parties that are heavily rooted in religious ideals, usually on the conservative end of the spectrum.
Go ahead. Anna. You said you had one for everybody.
So, well, if there were hands up, I relinquish the mic. But a question for Bianca, which is, I find this really interesting relationship between tribalism and monarchy as being a stabilizing force. And it strikes me that there's got to be something about the history of the monarchy so that it isn't isn't captured by any particular tribe and can play the role in some sense of an honest broker. And, Jordan looks a little bit like that. I know a little bit about any of this, but I'm wondering how that relationship emerged and where you would locate it.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for the question. One of my chapters is sort of more historical in that way, and tracks the political dialogues between the monarchy and the tribes, starting actually in the pre-protectorate period, which many scholars have termed a stable system of continuous violence, which seems sort of paradoxical. But what's sort of interesting about this period is even before Morocco was a state, before there was a centralized bureaucracy, there was a deeply rooted connection between the tribes and the monarchy that was rooted in the king as this symbolic leader, as a religious leader. And so even so much as tribes during this period were against any form of political domination, they did not want Morocco to integrate them into any future iteration of a state that would later form. They still had deep respect for the king. There's this one anecdote that came up in my research where there was this tribe that was called a dissident tribe, meaning that it was basically against the Moroccan political domination. And that tribe was actively at war with the Sultan, but it sent a delegation to go ask his advice on how they should divide up some property. So even though they were warring with the king at points, they still saw him as this, ultimate mediator, the sort of ventriloquist of the whole system. And I think that relationship, especially, throughout the colonial and post-colonial period, was only strengthened. And these negotiations and political dialogues between the tribes and the state are really the backdrop of political stability during the Arab Spring. And I think that history is essential towards really understanding that contemporary relationship.
Thank you. Congratulations to all of you. It was wonderful to hear your research. My question is for Yab. I'm interested to hear more about how the people in Mali and Mauritania, which were two of your cases, understand monetary funds or monetary policy and how they interact with the different mechanisms of the state and their fiscal policies.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, so in the sort of research design, one thing that I was doing, like I mentioned, is in process tracing, looking at shifts in stability in both Mali and Mauritania. And what I'd seen is that even when there are sort of protests or demonstrations against, let's say, public budgets, drop, or there's an increase in taxes, increase in prices, the protest usually isn't necessarily directly to the union or being in that union, but rather towards conditional loans and structural adjustment programs. And specifically today, we're looking at, for instance, the Alliance of Sahel States of Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger. And at this time, we're looking also at a more alliance with unionizing, and even in political alliances. And so I'd say that over the events that I've been studying, I see more of the protests and demonstrations going against the government or even against conditional loans itself, but not necessarily being in the union. As I mentioned, Mauritania being the control state even has those same protest demonstrations, even though it's not in the union. So yeah, I hope that answered the question.
Veronica, did you have a question?
It's very related to the last question. It's for Yab too. So I was curious, you talked about the austerity programs in monetary unions. And in some cases you said those austerity programs were coming when there was financial independence from the monetary policy of the unions themselves. Of the monetary union themselves. But in other cases, you said when there's less financial independence, you said it was externally imposed by the IMF, by the World Bank. So I wonder if you have looked at the relative stability or instability of those two alternatives.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's a great question. So one of sort of two things. One is in terms of sort of cross case study. I'm looking at France, in the EMU, where you see much of the conditional loans, much of the I'll call it structural adjustment, comes from the union itself because it is able to fund those loans, right? But in terms of Mali, we're looking at the fact, and even Mauritania, it's not able to fund those loans. The government themselves aren't able to. And so those external conditional loans come with external conditions, right? And so I'd say that that is the level of comparison of looking at France and the level of sort of political stability and shifts in stability, and looking at Mali and Mauritania, both of which, like I mentioned, are reliant on external conditional loans. But I'd also say what you mentioned right now, it's very interesting, and is part of sort of the future research aspect of my study, is looking at states within the same union. For instance, looking at Mali and Niger, and sort of comparing the level of reliance, if being sort of still being in that union, if the level of reliance in conditional loans affects the level of shifts in stability. So yeah, that would be wonderful research too. Thank you for your question.
Thanks, all of you. My question is for Bianca. You talked about tribalism, but you also mentioned the Amazigh, and these are kind of two different things, right? There's a kind of cultural, ethnic, national group, and there's tribes. So I'm curious if you could say a little bit more about how you see the role of each of those kind of forms of identification playing a role in Morocco, and whether, again, since this is kind of something that's across North Africa, whether you see these groups playing a different kind of role in places like Libya or Algeria that had different outcomes in the kind of post-2010, 2011 uprisings.
Yeah, thank you. There are a bunch of different types of tribes in Morocco, and for the purposes of this thesis, I've decided to narrow in on the Amazigh tribes in particular. But as you just pointed out, to some, they aren't just tribes. They are also an ethnic group. According to United Nations, they have status as the indigenous people of North Africa. And, in conversations with Amazigh activists themselves, they use all of these different terms to describe their own identity within the state. But I think one thing that was really striking to me in one-on-one conversations with people is that when they were talking about their identification with a tribe, they used the term qabila, which is Arabic for tribe. They did not say majmua arqiya, which is ethnic group. They did not say al-asliyin, which is indigenous group. The term tribe was sort of specifically used in this self-identification with a group in Morocco, which is why I use tribalism as sort of my lens of analysis. And in particular, I also use it because I think that's just completely misunderstood within the literature as being a harbinger of political instability, as I discussed in the presentation. And so I wanted to recapture the meaning of the term and also contribute to literature that is more updated on the roles in which tribalism can play in cultivating political stability. And in my thesis, I also talk about kind of the international role of the Amazigh cultural movement. It doesn't feature as prominently in part because of time and space, and I had to focus specifically on the Moroccan context. But I do think that it's incredibly important to keep in mind the fact that this is a regional phenomenon. I think Morocco provided the most adequate case study for my research questions, in part because it has the largest percentage of Amazigh people. It's between 40 and 60% of the population, which I know is quite a large range, but there aren't really formal statistics. And then also the fact that Morocco, even compared to other states, such as Algeria, which by some standards did not experience an Arab Spring, was still vastly more political stability when you look at indicators of absence of violence and turmoil. I hope that answered your question. Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question.
My question is for Gigi. When Women Life Freedom movement happened in Iran, it was a very progressive movement led by women for individual rights and liberties, and everybody was very hopeful about it. And now, after 2 years, when the protests went down, the oppositional forces from various groups, monarchists, Republicans, left-wingers, they are debating the future of Iran. And I came across two main patterns. One was the return to the Shah, with sort of like up-to-date version of the return to the Shah of the 21st century. And the other was the more Republican in the sense of having a republic for Iranians, a secular democratic republic for Iranians. Have you come across any patterns in your interviews to see which is like the people you talk to? Because I don't know the answer, and this is something that has been debated across, but have you come across any findings of what the future is that people imagine? Thank you.
Yeah, I talk about that a little bit in my conclusion. One of the most interesting things about my interviews that didn't it's kind of this essence of like all we know is that we don't know. And this idea that like while there will be a path forward for Iran at some point that looks vastly different than what it looks like now because of this kind of growing sentiment of political opposition, this growing idea of secularism, what that manifests is like a huge unknown. And there was a lot of discussion about the return of the Shah, obviously with like heavy modifications to the return of the Shah, but this idea that pre-Islamic Republic Iran is something that's worth fighting for and trying to bring back. And so that's like very heavy in the discourse. And then again, so is this idea of republicanism. And so the future itself is, I don't feel like I can make a prediction on it. Like, I don't feel like that's something I'm prepared to do. And a lot of the people I spoke to, made a similar argument. Many people actually said that during Women Life Freedom, they would go to conferences and they would say that this was the fall of the Islamic Republic. And then, it hasn't been the fall of the Islamic Republic. So it's really hard to predict. But I do think that what we can kind of infer from my research is that what exists now in the form of an Islamic regime is not something that's going to be sustainable in the long term. And that overarchingly, the Iranian people have, made a decision about the ideas of equality and egalitarianism and justice that they want to see in a future government. So I think whatever it looks like, it'll hold those tenets.
Okay. All right. Well, I think it's time to take a little break and prepare for the next presentation or panel. Let's give this group a huge applause.